As a first-time Soulsborne player, here are some of the standout impressions from my first run-through of Elden Ring. A bit of my thoughts before completing the whole game. Is the game worth playing if you're not a previous Soulsborne player? Are you worried about the difficulty scaling and not sure if it's worth risking the money? Well, here are some of the major pros and cons I encountered on my quest to become Elden Lord, and I'll give you all the reasons behind my conclusion. If you're interested in picking up the game since the new DLC is dropping in a few months, maybe this will give you some idea of what you're committing to. The too long, didn't watch conclusion I can give you right at the jump is that the game is worth playing if you're willing to dedicate 100+ hours to a massive open-ended game, and you're willing to endure one of the longest anti-tutorial ramp-up sessions I've ever seen in a game. You'll get at least 100 hours of content out of the game, but the first 10 to 20 hours are going to be a slog and are going to feel like suffering getting to the fun times. If you're a player who enjoys earning their fun and can handle the delayed gratification, then it's great for you. If you've got enough time to dedicate that you can reap the rewards after the early game hazing process, it's a great game. You just have to eat your vegetables before you get to enjoy the dessert. But if you have limited amounts of time to dedicate to a game, and usually expect a game to wrap up in 40 hours, the sick and twisted early game is probably just going to feel like a chore that you never make it past. So if you're willing to no-life the game, it's worth it. If you want to casual game it, I'm not so sure. The actual filtering of the game from the difficulty is less of a skill brick wall and more of a time gate. So if you're willing to make this your primary game for several weeks, maybe even a couple months, you'll make it through all of the filters eventually. So what's the deal with the early game onboarding? Well, the game starts the player at what feels like an abysmally low power level. Compared to other RPGs, in Elden Ring, levels 1 through 10, even up until level 20 I'd say, are the equivalent of being essentially a negative level in another game. It's only around level 25 or 30 that the player character begins to feel like they have basic competency, in terms of having enough stamina to perform more than 2 actions before fatiguing, having enough health to survive a few hits, enough mana to cast more than a few skills or spells, and enough weight limit and required stats to equip meaningful items. The first few NPCs you run into will make comments about your insignificant status, so the game does warn you in the universe. But if you don't take those characters at the word and think to yourself, well, this is just for dramatic effect, the early game scaling can be a lot to adjust to. The characters are not lying when they tell you that your status as a Tarnished is wretched and pathetic.
You are fated, it seems, to die in obscurity.
So yeah, have fun with being a pleb. Seriously, have fun with it, because you'll be at that level for a while, grinding through it. Overall, the attribute system works really well, and I don't have much complaints here. With each level earned, you earn 1 extra attribute point you can spend as you choose. The only weirdness here is that 1 attribute per level can feel like a small reward when you first start playing, compared to other RPGs where you gain a bit of every attribute on level up. Combined with the fact that you'll die a lot at the start and likely be losing a lot of runes, which is the equivalent to experience points, to death, the scaling can be a bit punishing and slow at first. The key to overcoming this is to adapt to the punishing combat, learn to take smart fights, and to stop losing your runes. Once you get the basic combat mechanics down and stop deleting runes, the early levels will actually roll in pretty quickly, at which point the 1 attribute per level concept doesn't feel that bad, and this progression system will contribute a lot to the sense of satisfaction you get in the mid-game when you really do start to feel your character ramp up into something more resembling a hero. The game opens up a lot more in the mid-game as your build develops, and you start feeling a bit more heroic, but it's going to take hours of grinding levels and practicing the mechanics before that happens. When it does, it is very rewarding. You definitely feel like you've earned that power spike, which is a sense of accomplishment that the game does do really well, but the learning curve to get there can be a bit brutal. Learning how the player mechanics work is arguably way more important than just leveling at the start of the game, and the primary mechanic you'll be learning is the dodge roll. When you perform a roll, there are a few invincibility frames, or moments in your dodge where your character's hitbox essentially just stops registering hits from the enemy. This allows you to time your dodge rolls just right to negate the enemy's attack completely, although there are some exceptions to this, like if an attack has persisting duration. Personally, from an immersion and roleplay perspective, I don't love the game's reliance on iframes, which as I understand it is a staple of all Soulsborne games. I think the game would be more interesting if it had a better balance between dodge rolling, blocking with shields or weapons, and overall sustain from armor and recovery magic. As it is, the majority of sustain in the game, like a solid 90%, comes from your dodge rolling and healing flask mechanics, And even between those two, the dodge rolling is way more important than healing. The entire game feels excessively balanced around dodge rolling, although I spent significant periods of the time trying to work around that and rely more on blocking and sustain from armor and resistance. Shields are extremely powerful for damage negation, but they're best against the hallway monsters, and even then, only against small numbers of foes. Blocking hits destroys your stamina bar pretty quickly, so against multiple foes or against bosses that have tons of combo attacks, blocking loses its value significantly because you'll just end up stamina depleted, which sends your character into a full stagger when your shield stance gets broken. Armor is the most consistent, well-rounded way to tank damage, but wearing armor that gives meaningful benefits requires a huge weight cost on your character, so you have to boost the hell out of your endurance stat, which governs encumbrance, in order to use armor effectively. The weight system is in a direct push-pull with the dodge roll system. Lighter armor and encumbrance, and you'll roll farther, recover your stance faster. Heavy armor and encumbrance, you'll roll like a sack of potatoes and take an eternity to get back on your feet. There's also the issue of the limits of the itemization itself, which I'll talk more about in a bit. And you can utilize incantations, which is the faith-based school of magic, to boost up your negations to elemental damage, or give yourself cures to status effects, which can definitely make your build more versatile and adaptable to specific situations, but it contributes just a fraction of the entire solution you need. So if your build doesn't work in other primary ways first, buffs really aren't going to save you. Unless maybe if you go full specialize into faith, this might change a bit, but I'm not sure. I wasn't a dedicated faith build. So that leads us into discussing the combat mechanics of the game, which can be divided into the hallway fights, which are the henchmen and goons of the dungeon, and the boss fights. The hallway fights do have a bit of variety, with some of the larger, well-armored goons being pretty terrifying mini-bosses in their own right, kind of a middle ground difficulty. In all these combat encounters, your best option is going to be the mythical dodge rolling, as we've already discussed. Shield blocking will be most viable in hallway fights and will fall off pretty quickly in viability against mini-bosses, and even worse against bosses. In hallway fights, unless you can get the jump on the monster and kill it with a critical hit ambush, or a series of attacks before it can respond, your best option is to wait for an attack, dodge, and counter. Much of the game relies on this wait, dodge, counter rhythm, and this becomes your only method of winning against the boss fights. Once you get into the tempo, it can certainly be a lot of fun, but it's not without its frustrations. You'll need to be patient, bait out attacks, and start watching animation patterns closely to time the incoming swings and react at the right window. The timing of when iframes will save you is pretty tight, and a lot of the monsters are designed with hesitating, delayed attack patterns. They'll lift their sword arm up into a strike position, fake you out, and swing a few beats later than you'd expect, which is a ton of fun to learn at the start of the game. As you start to follow the wait, dodge, counterattack model, you might get impatient like me and want to start unloading attacks in the counterattack phase, but if you're using anything short of the fastest weapons, most counterattack windows are basically one attack long. This can also be a pretty frustrating mechanic. At the start of the game, as you're learning the timing, often it will feel like you don't even have the room to counterattack because you'll counterswing too late, or be slightly out of position and have to do a corrective movement before swinging too late. Then once you start to tighten up that timing, your hero brain will start to kick in and you'll want to start greeting for multiple attacks in a counterattack window, and will likely be immediately punished for it. Sometimes the wait roll counter rhythm feels super nice, but other times the wait window will extend for way too long. The counter window will be way too short, and you'll want to go berserker rage mode and just start swinging. It really depends on the fight. Especially in the early game, the rhythm game can be really frustrating. What no one tells you, or no one told me, is that a Soulsborne game is actually a drum hero game, but you're playing a song that's at like 20 beats per minute, which, if you know anything about drumming, it's a huge headache to keep consistent time at very slow tempos. When your character is weak and your stats are low, your stamina bar is only big enough to do maybe 2 or 3 dodges with 1 counterattack. So not only will you be playing this slow, calculated rhythm game to get your attack windows, after one of these wait, roll, counter cycles, you're going to be stamina depleted, at which point you'll have to shift to the wait, and wait some more for your stamina to regenerate cycle. If you're playing the game to just marvel at the enemy design, sure, that's fine, but if you're getting antsy to actually play actively and smash things with your weapon, this wait to wait some more minigame can be really frustrating. There's really only 2 solutions to this early game stamina problem. One is to get really precise with your movements and exact with your dodging, to get really efficient with your stamina economy. Or if you're a new Souls player, the more likely option is to grind out a bunch of levels and juice up your endurance stat to increase your stamina bar. There are some other item options to help your stamina recovery. You can mix a Wondrous Flask pretty early on to increase your stamina regeneration, or you can start farming and devouring turtleneck meat for the same effect. But even with improved stamina recovery rates, your character won't start recovering until you stop performing any stamina-consuming inputs, which is pretty much any input you give your character. So while you can shorten the stamina recovery window, you won't be passively regenerating enough all the time to get out of doing one of these recovery phases. Again, it's kind of like a rhythm game, but maintaining the dodge rhythm can get really hard when you have to constantly stop dodging and simply retreat to a distance to recover your stamina. The situation gets a lot better in the mid-game once your endurance and stamina is way higher, but this isn't just a huge learning curve at the start of the game, it's a massive patience test. I can definitely understand why a lot of players would be turned away by this at the start of the game and might not be willing to grind through the lowly asthmatic tarnished phase of the game, not knowing when or even if it gets better, and not knowing when the playstyle gets more proactive instead of passive, reactive, and sluggish. This might also be a primary flaw of doing a melee style build. Caster types might have a much different experience with this. With that said, the hallway monsters are challenging enough that they actually are pretty fun to grind out, and you will need to grind them out a bit to farm up enough levels to start feeling heroic. Then, once you start to outscale them, they are still fun to bully and unleash your accumulated frustrations from earlier in the game on. And even as your damage scales up so you can delete some of the hallway monsters with ambushes and good positioning, they still remain pretty dangerous to you in terms of how much damage they can deal. So even as you get into a scenario where you can easily farm one, maybe 2 henchmen at a time, if you start rushing into squads of them, you'll get punished and waste a ton of flasks or even die, which helps ensure that you don't feel like you're just farming trivial monsters. The boss fights can range from a ton of fun to a ton of frustration. These are supposedly what the entire Souls franchise is all about. First off, the art design around the bosses is fantastic. The attack patterns are rich and complex, and the AI is solid and punishing. Depending on what type of player you are, you might have fun grinding out a boss, learning to defeat it while underpowered by learning the timing perfectly, and becoming a dodge-rolling maniac. Or if you don't like being smeared into a fine mist over and over again, you might just want to grind out in the open world, explore, and level up a bit until you have enough of a health buffer that you actually stay alive long enough to watch and learn the attack patterns. Real Souls heads will tell you that you have to fight every boss with a health bar that can't even take one hit, but I found the game more interesting and compelling by exploring the open world and coming back to boss fights with a substantial amount of power creep on my character. Maybe on secondary playthroughs, these bosses would be fun to fight with a handicap and challenge yourself, but I don't think going the masochistic route on the first playthrough is the best option. Unless you're just built different, I guess. The good news, or bad news, depending, is that there are a lot of bosses. A lot of bosses. The most amount of bosses I've ever seen in a video game. This is actually a pretty compelling game design, and I like it a lot. Whether you're doing a challenge run or a grind and level run, you're going to constantly have another harder test ahead of you. Even if you're a grinder, the sheer amount of bosses available means you're never really going to completely overgrind, outlevel, and trivialize the game. Just mow through a few bosses and the power creep will start to match your level again. And once you get better at winning the boss fights, they do give pretty significant experience points. When you start earning the victories, either through skill or raw levels, you can actually farm a lot of experience very efficiently by winning boss fights quickly. If you get on a good streak, you might knock out 5 or 10 levels super quickly, depending on what area of the game you're in, and that does feel awesome to see the back-to-back-to-back drops of huge numbers of runes. But that won't be the case at the start of the game as you're learning. As you're ramping up your character, the first boss fights are likely going to slow your progression, and grinding runes from the hallway monsters will give you way more benefit than fighting these first few bosses. I do think the amount of rewards you get from just one boss, especially at the start of the game, are a bit underwhelming. If you can grind out a bunch in a row, it feels great, definitely. But in the early game, you're likely going to spend hours learning and grinding the first bosses to learn the rhythm of the game and practice your dodge rolling. When the bosses take hours to complete, the experience granted isn't that significant. And many of the items dropped by the early bosses are also a bit underwhelming. Maybe because the item power is too low, or maybe because the power level is actually pretty high, but it has a corresponding stat requirement that you won't meet for 20 or 30 more levels. So, another patience game. All of these factors combine in an interesting way. Early game, you're going to want to just grind some levels, fighting easy monsters with decent rune drops. You'll want to practice your dodge timing against hallway monsters, but then you'll feel even more punished in boss fights as you watch your stamina bar deplete to 0 before you can do anything meaningful. Once you decide to move beyond hallway monsters and fight some of these early bosses, you're going to lock yourself into hours-long commitments, and the in-game reward you'll get after conquering those bosses won't actually feel that significant. In reality, the most important reward in leveling up you're doing in the early game is learning the mechanics, the rhythm of wait, dodge, counterattack, memorizing your attack patterns and weapon spacing, learning the movement speed of your character, learning when to reposition by sprinting, rolling, jumping, or just normal movement. But these player skills won't really be represented by tangible numbers in your status screen until hours later, when those improvements translate into more efficient farming and leveling. This might be a delayed gratification that some gamers really love and feel the sense of accomplishment from, but I think a lot of people have to endure an oppressively long window of frustration before that accomplishment sets in. And the frustration isn't simply because of the enemies themselves feeling challenging, but also from the player character feeling comically underpowered and unheroic, with a punishing stamina mechanic that will lock you into long periods of waiting, watching, reacting too late, and being forced back into waiting. The frustration of the enemy design compounds with the sluggishness of the character and punishing inputs to really tax your patience. Maybe this is just because I'm a first-time Souls player, but I can honestly say that the first 10 hours of the game really weren't all that fun, and the next 10 hours weren't that much better. After about 20 hours in, I started to actually understand the input style of the game from a user perspective, and I started to see enough stat increases from an in-character perspective that I didn't feel completely weak and powerless. Now, overall, the game has enough content in it that you still have 100 more hours of good game time ahead of you after finishing this initial 20-hour slog. So, if you have the patience and commitment to push past this, there's a lot of beautiful world design and challenging boss fights left to enjoy. But, on the other hand, there are plenty of other games whose runtime itself is only 40, 50, maybe 60 hours, and from that perspective, I can see how grinding Elden Ring for an initial 20 hours of not that fun gameplay is a big ask to actually get to the fun stuff. In terms of another game having a 40-hour window of playing time, asking the Elden Ring player to grind out 20 hours of what amounts to an extended, self-taught tutorial is a big ask. Is it worth it? Yeah, sure, it is. But it's only worth it if you have either the time or focus commitment to plan on playing through Elden Ring to the end of its 100+ hour runtime. If you're approaching this game at all with the mindset of a normal 40 or 50 hour game, the first week of grinding and leveling just feels like a chore. In terms of itemization, I have a bunch of extended thoughts that are probably best for a general overall review of the game. The short of it is, the game does provide a huge variety of weapons, armor, and spell options, but overall I don't feel like the game provides very meaningful choices, and the variety just gives you the illusion of choice. Weapon variety is locked behind restrictive stat requirements, and worse, a blacksmithing upgrade system with pretty limited smithing materials, at least in the first 3/4 of the game. The upgrade system provided a huge amount of friction on my playthrough, as once I found the first significant weapon that really worked well for me, it was hard to test out anything else to see if it was worth it because of the limited amount of smithing materials in the early and mid-game. Armor variety was also mostly a cosmetic option, with a lot of the armors providing near equivalent damage reductions, maybe just shifting around elemental or status resistances here and there. The biggest factor in how much protection an armor provides is really coming from its weight class. Light, medium, or heavy, and early game I found a set of heavy armor that had close to 80% the protective power of a late game set. The most restrictive factor in managing what armor I could wear was the weight class system, because having a character in the heavy encumbrance makes your dodge rolling just super ineffective. Because of that, oftentimes I would get increases to my defense not by looting better armor, but by upgrading my endurance weight limit so I could equip more pieces of the heavy armor I had already found early game. So unfortunately, I felt pretty restricted on what weapons I could actually meaningfully use, and most of the choices you make surrounding armor will either be use the heaviest, best armor for your weight restrictions, or choose an armor based on style and fashion, since the attribute variances aren't really that significant within your weight class. Oh, and it also seemed to me like 90% of the armors are light and medium classes, so if you do go heavy armor, you have like 3 or 4 fashion options there. Yeah. I can't speak to the magic systems too directly, especially the intelligence-based sorcery skill, which is basically the offensive school of magic. I was running Faith as a secondary stat, and the incantation school that it provides mostly dealt with buffs, heals, and status cures, although it did provide a bit of defensive damage spells, like mostly low and mid-range damage options. I did try and make a lot of different Faith damage spells work as range options to give me different attack patterns or damage over time effects. but ultimately I couldn't get any of these to work, at least not in the boss fights where it really mattered. The damage scaling on those spells was too low with Faith as a secondary stat to be worth casting in a boss fight, and the slow cast times just made me more vulnerable rather than provided versatility. The ranges were too short to cast them safely, at least not without a summoned ally to distract, and I wasn't utilizing the summon mechanic in my run. The most success I had with Faith damage spells was using Lightning Bolt on some hallway monsters that were oppressive to fight close quarters, basically cheesing some annoying fights from a distance. That's not to say that splashing magic wasn't useful overall. It was. My Faith magic gave me access to elemental resistance buffs and damage increasing buffs that did huge work for me in boss fights, as well as some status cures that were very helpful in the overworld and exploring. But I do think it would have helped the build diversity a ton if the magic options were more meaningful at the scaling of a secondary attribute. A more flexible character with different range options would have been a bit more engaging to play, I think. So, for me, the best feature of the game is definitely the massive sprawling open world and the exploration. So the pros of the open world: it's awesome, it's fun, it's beautiful, it's big. Cons? It's big. It takes a long time to explore. As I touched on in the start of the video about the early game leveling and learning the game's movement and combat mechanics, this game expects a pretty significant time commitment, and in my opinion is most rewarding that way. Especially if you're a new Souls player, or even if you're a returning Souls player on your first Elden Ring playthrough, learning the attack patterns of every monster, you'll likely want to be investing time into scaling your character through leveling, finding flask charges, discovering new talismans that work overall for your build, boosting damage and recovery, or finding other talismans that work situationally like Elemental Resistance Talisman. After you've learned the attack patterns and systems of the game, you can definitely replay it and try to progress at lower levels to challenge yourself. But unless you're a total masochistically minded player, you probably won't want to grind your bones into dust just perpetually dying on your first playthrough, and instead spend more of that time grinding your horse's bones into dust exploring the world and farming levels in the process. The open world was the best part of the game for me, hands down. I went into the game with an exploring and map completionist mindset, trying to explore every section of the map. The game actively encourages this, giving you broad map unlocks all at once that help you identify points of interest, and scattering tons of collectibles, weapons, talismans, and rune currency/experience throughout the world. The level of detail that went into designing the open world is absolutely insane. Just an amazing labor of love by the development team, and it's very rewarding. Some of the most beautiful, most cinematic camera shots you'll get are from just exploring the open world, riding up to a cliffside or coming around a corner and getting a breathtaking perspective of a rising great tower, a looming castle, or the ever-present Erd tree framing the landscape. Riding through this game is like walking through a painting made by a master artist, and you'll be getting these photographic moments, these awe-inspiring shots not just a few times in the game, which would already be a huge success on the part of any art team, but constantly throughout the game. The rendering distance in the game is cranked up to the maximum, and there's really no loading screens dividing the open world, so you'll be able to see previews of where you'll end up later, or recaps of where you've been as you view these grand sweeping vistas. That gets a bit more into the artistry and thematics of the game that I'd like to touch on in another discussion, but it warrants a mention here in the initial impressions, just so it doesn't seem like it's all negative, because it's definitely not. It's the open world beauty, this feeling of riding first person through a living, moving painting that kept me playing the game through the early hours that felt most frustrating. So I really can't overstate how good the art design is. It's extremely stylistic, it's coherent, and the individual pieces all work with each other and come together to make a brilliant whole. It's beautiful, it's haunting, it's just fantastic artwork. Some aspects of the open world are definitely more rewarding than others in terms of item finds. As you learn the patterns and rhythms of the game, like the importance of the caves and mines, you'll get a better sense later in the game of where you can focus your time and what aspects you might want to skip if you're so inclined. But the compelling art helps keep you distracted and entertained, even as you explore and find just runes and not, say, another weapon or a talisman or a boss fight. Oh, and there's a ridiculous amount of side bosses scattered in the open world and throughout side dungeons, so if you're playing the game for the glory of destroying disgusting fell beasts, the open world will absolutely encourage and reward you for exploring it. Whenever I felt like the main story boss was too overpowered for my current level, I just went and explored and came back later. And as I learned that rhythm of the game and the side quests, my experience got a ton better, and I stopped running into brick walls on the main story. There are really only two downsides to the open world. The first is just that it's so huge, immersive, and inviting that it's a huge time commitment to explore. So, similar to how the first 20 hours of the game are so punishing, and this can be a detriment to a gamer with a 40-hour mindset for the game, the open world presenting such a canvas to explore might seem a bit too much for a gamer who isn't planning on just playing nothing but Elden Ring for the next 2 months straight. The second downside to the open world is that as a new player, you're going to be a bit unclear as to where to explore, and I think this is a big mistake I made in my first playthrough. Do you follow the destiny direction markers the game gives you and progress through the first dungeon? And if not, where do you explore, since every area seems to be brutally challenging at the start? And it's easy to worry that if you explore too far from the first story dungeon, Stormvale Castle, aren't the zones only going to ramp up in difficulty? I thought I explored pretty thoroughly at the start of the game, honestly, but in retrospect I should have explored the open world a lot more before fighting the first story bosses. It's also possible that you might go out exploring and just pick the wrong direction to go in, hit a brick wall of difficulty, and choose to go back to the main story quest. I definitely missed out on exploring the area southeast of Limgrave, the Weeping Peninsula, when I should have, because I expected the story markers to eventually point me in that direction when I got up to that power level. At some point, I realized the main story quest was pointing me in the exact opposite direction, and I went back to explore it. But at that point, I had outleveled that area a ton. I then found a bunch of flask healing upgrades and other miscellaneous items on the peninsula that would have helped me clear the first castle, the main story, and that I should have already had those going into the boss fight, but oh well, I was still victorious eventually. So I do think that there are some weaknesses in how they set up the guiding grace markers on the map that are meant to point you towards the main storyline. I also did my first playthrough using basically no guides or resources and playing blind, like in the olden Elden days of gaming. So I might not have made these errors if I had looked at even just a tiny bit of non-spoiler guides. But that said, I did really enjoy playing the game in this old school self-discovery type of way, and I definitely recommend it. It's just that the open world is so huge and presents so many options that it's possible you might miss some pretty important talismans or explore in a specific direction where you won't realize you're fighting a boss encounter and you're missing a few flasks. With that said, don't be too married to the golden grace markers that point you around in the game towards the main storyline, especially at the start. I'm sure it's been said before in other reviews, but it's kind of a red herring, misleading you from what you should be doing at the start of the game, which is looking everywhere but where the grace is guiding you. Coupled with the fact that the game has basically no tutorial and very little guidance otherwise, and it's pretty easy to make this mistake, I think. So overall, is the game worth it? Yes, absolutely. Is it a good game? Yeah, definitely. But it has an insane amount of content and expects a huge time commitment from the player to complete the game. This is a pro and a con. The player definitely gets a ton of content for the money they spend, but if you play the game with the normal expectations that you have towards a 40-hour game, the intense hazing and onboarding of the first 20 levels and the time it takes to progress through them can be extremely frustrating. I can definitely understand why some players wouldn't want to slog through this early game process. I know I struggled with it. And if you aren't going to make it past this early game hazing, then the overall content per dollar of the game is kind of irrelevant. It's kind of like when an MMO player tells you you need to play 50 or 100 hours before the game gets good and you'll enjoy yourself. Some players aren't looking to pay their dues by eating dirt before the game starts to reward them. I don't think Elden Ring is anywhere near as bad as those MMO curves, but Elden Ring has the additional factor of being extremely difficult and punishing during this onboarding process, while a massive multiplayer will be more of a slog and a grind, but oftentimes be easy to progress in these early hours. The combination of the difficulty, the slow rhythm gameplay requiring insane patience, and the lack of guidance from the game can really contribute to making the early game of Elden Ring just feel extremely daunting. The early game directions it points you in can actually send you down the completely wrong path for actually progressing your character if you keep dying and losing runes. And while the game certainly deserves a ton of praise for not excessively tutorializing and cluttering the player perspective with intrusive UI elements, the path that the grace guides you on is a bit misleading for the power level your character starts at, and coupled with the overall lack of story and other lore at the start of the game, it can leave the player feeling a bit lost and directionless, which presents a whole other problem. The story itself is also rather vague and nebulous, even when you do start following it and amassing more lore, but that's a criticism for a different video. If you can embrace the lack of direction and push through, finding a path to grind levels and picking the right combat encounters to learn the movement and your class's combat mechanics, finding a path to victory, then the game is definitely worth it. For the players who are willing to commit to the long-term relationship of Elden Ring, the crushing difficulty curve at the start of the game only serves to make the payoff of the mid and late game that much more rewarding. And the game itself is an exercise in delayed gratification, a concept that not a ton of games choose to engage in. This can be a very rewarding and enriching process as long as the player knows what they're getting into. Elden Ring is an amazing game, but it's a very different gameplay experience from the vast majority of other games out there that strive to be fun and rewarding from the very first minute of gameplay. I definitely think it's worth playing. Do believe the hype, but understand that when people give it the moniker of best game of 2022 or even best game of all time, that comes with some pretty extreme caveats. And if you're intrigued by the new content coming with the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC in June, you better get started on the vanilla game soon, because it's a solid month or two of challenges to beat the vanilla game and unlock the portal to the DLC content. Alright, well, that's my overview of Elden Ring from a first-time player's perspective. Again, this is a review before finishing the game, so some of these opinions will probably mature and develop. This is my first go at doing a more long-form critique/analysis video. So if you have any comments or suggestions, I'd love to hear them. There's still lots I want to do to improve the format, but, you know, the first shot. Anyway, if you found this video helpful at all, hit the like button, feel free to subscribe, maybe consider sharing the video with someone else who has been fence-sitting about buying the game, or was struggling getting past the early game. I'm planning on knocking out some more videos on vanilla Elden Ring, and then continuing with some Shadow of the Erdtree stuff as well. So more to come in the series. I also stream on Twitch, usually weekday evenings, Pacific time zone, at twitch.tv/robotio. So if you want to watch some of the gameplay where I'm formulating these thoughts and raging out dying to bosses, I'd love to see some of you come hang out and chat with me. Links down in the description, and I hope to catch some of you there and or in the next video.